What if the very thing designed to protect you became your worst enemy? In 1907, Henry Child, a wealthy aristocrat, moved with his two children, Emma and Thomas, from England to a sprawling mansion in the secluded hills of Virginia. They sought peace, a fresh start, far from the bustling city. Little did they know, the mansion held secrets darker than any they could have imagined. It all started when Henry found the old, dusty blueprints of the mansion. Hidden beneath layers of forgotten history was a strange marking on the plans, something that didn't belong. A section of the house that wasn't visible to the eye, tucked away in the farthest corner of the estate. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling him, something ancient and dark, lying in wait. Henry was no fool. He knew there was something wrong about the house, but he brushed it off, convincing himself it was just the burden of moving to a new place. He focused instead on making a life for his children, ensuring they had everything they needed. Yet, each passing night, he couldn't ignore the chilling whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. The cold air that chilled his bones even on the warmest evenings. One night, while walking through the corridors, Henry stumbled upon an old, creaking door tucked behind layers of dust in the back hallway. It was the door to the south corridor, the door that had no place in the house's original design. There was a faint, gnawing feeling inside him, urging him to stay away from it. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, one that he couldn't resist. He pushed the door open, and what he found on the other side shattered everything he knew about his family, his life, and the house itself. The house had its own language, Henry realized, though he couldn't quite understand it. The creaks in the floorboards, the groan of the wooden beams. It all felt deliberate, like the mansion itself was trying to speak. Each sound carried an edge, sharp enough to cut through the forced calm Henry wore around his children. Emma was the first to change. She refused to sleep with the door closed now, and her lamp burned through the night. Henry tried to comfort her, sitting by her bedside and stroking her hair, but her whispers unsettled him. "They're not bad people, Papa," she murmured one night, her eyes distant. "They just don't like us being here." Thomas, on the other hand, fought against the fear creeping into his heart. He was a brave one, the logical one. But even he couldn't ignore the unease that followed him through the halls. He told himself it was just a draft when the doors creaked open on their own. He told himself he hadn't really heard footsteps behind him when he walked the corridors alone. But each night he woke with the same dream. A dark figure standing at the foot of his bed, its face obscured, its breath cold as winter frost. Henry spent his nights in the study, pretending to be busy. It was easier to distract himself with the mundane tasks of organizing old papers and reading letters left behind by the previous owner. But one night, tucked away in a drawer, he found something he couldn't ignore. The papers were old, their edges brittle and yellowed. Blueprints of the mansion, drawn with an architect's precision, lay beneath a layer of dust. But it was a note scrawled in the margins that made his hands tremble. "Do not open it. Keep it locked." And one phrase repeated again and again, as if the writer had been consumed by a single, terrifying thought. The south corridor. Henry closed the drawer and sat back, the words echoing in his mind. The south corridor had remained locked since they arrived. The caretaker had mentioned it in passing, his voice hesitant, almost apologetic, as if speaking of it too much might invite something unwelcome. Henry had dismissed it then, but now the door to that corridor felt like a living thing, watching him, waiting for him to notice it. That night, the house seemed quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that smothers, pressing down on the lungs until every breath feels like a struggle. And then it started. Knock. The sound was faint at first, a gentle tapping that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Henry froze in his chair, straining to hear. Knock. Knock. It grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was demanding to be let out. He rushed to check on the children. Emma was sitting up in bed, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "They're angry, Papa," she whispered. "You shouldn't have found their things. In Thomas's room, the boy stood at the window, his small frame silhouetted against the moonlight. He didn't turn when Henry entered, didn't flinch when his father called his name. Instead, he lifted a trembling hand and pointed into the darkness outside. Henry followed his gaze, his eyes searching the shadowy landscape beyond the window. For a moment, there was nothing but the swaying of trees in the night breeze. But then he saw it, a figure, tall and impossibly still, standing just at the edge of the forest. Its outline was faint but unmistakable, and as Henry stared, it moved. Not like a person walking, but like a shadow stretching, gliding closer before vanishing into the black. Henry pulled the curtains shut, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a house. It was something older, something darker, and it wanted them to know that they weren't alone. Henry knew they couldn't stay another night. Something was wrong with the house. Deeply, terribly wrong, and it was spreading to his children like a sickness. The south corridor's door loomed in his mind, its presence growing heavier with each passing moment. But the blueprints he'd found earlier, they had hinted at something more, a hidden room, tucked away beyond that door. He tried to convince himself it was curiosity driving him, the desire to understand what the house was hiding. But deep down he knew the truth. It wasn't curiosity, it was fear. Fear that whatever was locked away in that corridor was already reaching for them. Late that night, when the house was cloaked in silence, Henry crept toward the south corridor with a lantern in hand. The air grew colder as he approached, his breath visible in the dim glow of the light. The door was massive, its wood darkened with age, the brass handle tarnished and cold to the touch. He hesitated, hearing the faint whispers that seemed to come from within. They weren't words, not exactly, just a low, guttural sound, like a chorus of voices too faint to understand. Henry turned the handle. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a long hallway that stretched farther than it should have, given the size of the house. The lantern's glow barely pierced the darkness, but it was enough to show the strange symbols etched into the walls. Symbols that felt wrong, their shapes jagged and alien. And then he saw it. At the end of the hallway, the room stood as the blueprints had promised. But it wasn't just a room. It was a shrine. A stone altar sat in the center, surrounded by piles of what looked like offerings, trinkets, toys, even faded photographs. But it wasn't the altar that made Henry's skin crawl. It was the figure standing beside it. The figure was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a tattered hood. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but Henry could feel its presence like a weight on his chest. And then, without warning, the lantern went out. Darkness swallowed him whole. He fumbled for the matches in his pocket, his hands trembling as he struck one against the stone wall. The faint light revealed the figure had moved. Closer now, its hooded face tilted as though studying him. Henry stumbled backward, the match slipping from his grasp. In the distance, he heard Emma's voice, faint and trembling. "Papa, come back?" He turned and ran. The corridor stretched endlessly, each step feeling heavier, slower, as if the house itself was fighting to keep him there. But Henry didn't stop until he burst into the children's rooms. They were waiting for him, standing side by side, their faces pale but calm. Emma held Thomas's hand tightly, her eyes locked on her father. "It's not the house, Papa," she whispered. "It's us. It's always been us." Before Henry could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Slow, deliberate. He turned to see the figure emerging from the shadows of the corridor. It stood slipping back to reveal nothing, just an empty void where its face should have been. The children didn't scream. They didn't cry. Instead, they stepped forward, their small hands reaching out as if drawn to the figure. Henry tried to stop them, but he couldn't move, his body frozen in place. The last thing he heard was Emma's voice, soft and eerily calm. "We're going home now, Papa. Don't worry." And then silence. When the caretaker arrived the next morning, the mansion was empty. No sign of Henry or the children, just the south corridor door wide open and the faint sound of whispers lingering in the air.